This is Harmony, a Unitarian Universalist community. We are a lay-led congregation based in the northeast suburbs of Cincinnati, balancing faith and reason since 2009.
A two-person service virtually. So I would offer her to give us a little forgiveness as we're going to try and do this back and forth. When Julie offered a chance to work with her, I'd say that I jumped at it because Julie's amazing at this. She does amazing work, and to be associated with stuff, service that she did, would something that I absolutely love to do. But I think at this point, I'm going to turn it over to her to start, and it will be a little bit of back and forth on our dive into cancel culture. So, Julie, I'm going to turn it over to you to start.
Cool. Thank you. So I wanted to take a different approach to writing this sermon. So in addition to reaching out to Rob, I really wanted to dive deep into peer-reviewed journals, find some solid backing for what we are up here talking about. So, brace yourself for some heady science right off the bat. According to the Muggle's Guide to Harry Potter, there are 3 unforgivable curses within the wizarding world. They are so named because they are unforgivable. The Imperious Curse, wherein you take control of another witch or wizard in order to have them do your bidding. The Cruciatus Curse, which is a torture curse. And finally, the Killing Curse. The use of any of these curses will land you in Azkaban prison. Now, I realize I've just laid a lot of really intense information on all of you, but I'm hoping that it sets the tone for an exploration of what is considered unforgivable in our society. Certainly as Muggles, we don't have an Azkaban prison. However, we have something else that is frequently used: cancel culture.
So cancel culture is this explosive term that really dominates a lot of cultural, and maybe it's summed up by the famous English authors who said the statement: the chief danger to freedom of thought and speech at this moment is not the direct interference of any official body. If publishers and editors exert themselves to keep certain topics out of print, it is not because they are frightened of prosecution, but because they are frightened of public opinion. In this country, intellectual cowardice is the worst enemy a writer and journalist has to face. The sinister fact about literacy censorship in England is it is largely voluntary. However, this may not be the English author that you were thinking about. This line was written by George Orwell as the preface to his novel Animal Farm.
So if I started by rattling off some names, my guess is that it wouldn't take you long for you all to find a common link among them. Names such as Bill Cosby, Louis C.K., Roseanne Barr, Al Franken, just to name a few. I would also be remiss if I didn't bring up J.K. Rowling's pending cancellation in response to her ongoing comments that have been viewed as transphobic. All of these celebrities, to varying degrees and for a variety of reasons, have been canceled. Cancellation has been adopted and used more widely when a celebrity says or does something that requires consequences, such as taking away or attempting to take away their power or their platform. However, civilians are also subject to cancellations, with instances of editors being fired for running controversial pieces, journalists being prevented from writing on certain topics altogether, and even college admissions being revoked due to inappropriate or offensive social media posts surfacing. In fact, recently, just at 2 area colleges, a prospective student athlete at Xavier had their admissions revoked due to racist tweets. And NKU students and alum are pressuring the school's administration to revoke the admission of an 18-year-old young woman for a tweet that referenced white lives mattering more than black lives. So in addition to the individual who was canceled, if an onlooker dissents from the decision to cancel, they run the risk of social disintegration themselves. When subscribing to an ideological identity, such as left-leaning liberal, social justice warrior, etc., it seems someone has to be all in or run the risk of being ostracized. I have several questions around the purpose, necessity, and consequences of cancel culture, which we will hopefully explore somewhat today. As of late, cancel culture has been described as having almost a cult-like appeal, with forgiveness and redemption seemingly out of the question and being replaced by condemnation and excommunication. Some have argued that cancel culture simply equates to an apocalyptic perspective, in that cancel culture sees the world as needing to be destroyed or replaced rather than improved or perfected. This really begs the question of the benefits of cancel culture in general. Is it possible that by suppressing harmful or unpopular thoughts, we are creating more of a problem? After all, liberalism is supposed to clear a wider space for debate, allow for a broad range of personal expressions. When we allow for this open communication and expression of ideas, we have to assume that a certain percentage of said ideas will be what some, ideally most, people would find deplorable. However, suppression of these ideas poses more of a danger than allowing them to be expressed. Dr. Grant Brenner describes cancel culture as collective ADHD, which is caused by a need to immediately manage distress through action. He states we are using spot remover to clean up the stains, but no one is deep cleaning the rugs. Now, there's also some debate about the existence or validity of cancel culture altogether. Is confronting someone over offensive or damaging words or deeds a cancellation or an attempt to hold someone accountable? New York Times columnist Charles Blow tweeted the following regarding cancel culture. Once more, there is no such thing as cancel culture. There's free speech. You can say and do as you please, and others can choose to never deal with you, your company, or your products ever again. The rich and powerful are just upset that the masses can now organize their dissent. And AOC also weighed in, sharing similar sentiments. The term cancel culture comes from entitlement, as though the person complaining has the right to a large captive audience and one is the victim if they choose to turn them out. Odds are you're not being canceled, you're just being challenged, held accountable, or unliked.
So, I'm probably on the train that disagree with AOC and Charles Blow here, because I think cancel culture probably does exist, but we probably need to work to understand what is the real definition. There are cases where people receive reasonable consequences from free speech, and there are cases where people receive unreasonable consequences, and in my mind, that clearly defines cancel culture. So it really, at the risk of being a little bit repetitive here, this sets up a lot of my sections. I'm going to kind of just hit that concept hard again. So I really believe what defines cancel culture is an unreasonable response to a statement or action. And we can all have our opinions about what is an unreasonable response, but I think it's important to start from this framework, and then we can hopefully discuss on a case-by-case basis what's cancel culture or not. But perhaps it's easiest to discuss if we define goalposts that most of us can agree represent both sides of this hypothesis, and then try and work our way towards a common middle. So I think most of us would agree that kind of McCarthyism and the fanatical search and destruction of any individual in the 1950s who appeared to even explore communist ideology is an example of unreasonable personal and professional consequences to their actions. Conversely, I think we can all probably agree that Hertz Rental Car acted responsibly, dropping O.J. Simpson, a sponsor, in 1994, despite being acquitted on a murder charge. Now, the challenge is to try and take those outsides and start moving inward on what are reasonable responses versus unreasonable responses, and probably what is cancel culture.
So, what could be considered a reasonable response or reaction to someone who has been canceled? And this is something that I struggle with when it comes to, I guess, celebrities whose product, craft, whatever I enjoy. A case in point for me is Bill Cosby, right? So a Facebook post from my own history, which I will preface by saying I posted in probably 2007 prior to his conviction and incarceration for rape. But it's interesting to think about, if I posted the same thing today, would I myself be at risk for cancellation? So this post read, "The Cosby Show is one of the greatest shows of all time." I would love to watch another episode of The Cosby Show. The Gordon Gartrell episode I found particularly hilarious, but I won't do it because I know that'll come with pangs of just ickiness and guilt. So the question becomes, do the crimes of Bill Cosby make the show any less of a cultural phenomenon? Cancel culture among celebrities really only exists to the extent to which people are willing to turn away from said celebrity's product, as pointed out by the tweet by Charles Blow, whether that's comedy, television, music, movies, books, what have you. So are we faced with the need to turn away from otherwise great works due to the sins of the creator? And as I thought more about this, I realized that I have a history of heated discussions with people around Woody Allen, as many continue to be avid consumers of his work, despite accusations of him sexually abusing his adoptive daughter. It seems much harder for someone to be canceled if there's a sincere enjoyment of and respect for their work. Woody Allen continues to be a hugely respected director who routinely works with A-list celebrities, many of whom claim to be advocates for women's rights. He's seemingly untouched by cancel culture. Why? The heated discussions I mentioned earlier also carried over and extended to conversations with my brother, which as I was writing that, I was like, hey, maybe this pattern of heated conversations is why I don't have a ton of friends. But anyway, so we were talking about Louis C.K. as my brother recently attended one of his stand-up shows. And I will say that Louis C.K. is someone whose stand-up I've always enjoyed. He did a bit about being stoned and discombobulated at a drive-through window that had me just in tears. It's like, yeah, gotta focus. But since the allegations were made and he came clean, I can't view him in the same way, and I haven't watched his comedy. So through the course of this conversation with my brother, he said the guy apologized, he took a break, what the hell else do you want? And the answer is that I don't really know. You know, he did take a 10-month pause in his career after admitting sexual impropriety with female comics, but he's since resumed his comedy career, hasn't really addressed anything, you know, has sold out shows, Netflix specials, the whole nine. So what do we want? Do we want the apocalyptic destruction or the opportunity to rebuild, grow, and learn? The three men I mentioned above were guilty of various crimes against women and no question should be held accountable. There is no society in which someone can do whatever they want and expect to maintain their reputation, their job, and depending on the offense, their freedom. However, when people are canceled for what about when people are canceled for thoughts and words? In a recent open letter published in Harper's, this very topic is explored. Again, the main tenet of a liberal society and democracy is the open sharing and expression of ideas. The letter argues that the way to defeat bad ideas is by exposure, argument, and persuasion, not by trying to silence or wish them away. And the internet, as we all know, is fertile ground for bad ideas. We're able to quickly dig up past transgressions, begin chastising the offender, and then demand consequences in one way, shape, or form.
So kind of building on that, you know, when I look at what's good on the internet or what it does well is that it's great at saving moments forever and it's great at broadcasting them to the whole world. And this becomes problematic in that what the internet mostly ignores is the fact that we are all continuously growing and evolving, meaning what we said in the past may not represent us today. And two, really that our thoughts are usually much more nuanced than the simplistic way the internet will pull apart a statement. So I'd really like to take those two issues that on the internet mostly ignores and look at them one at a time, because I think they're probably incredibly important to this this statement. So let's start out on the public. I'm sorry, on the personal growth. Let's start with the public statement. Marriage is between a man and a woman. We have a set of traditions and values that need to be preserved. So this was said in 2004. And does anyone know who said this? Barack Obama. So a man shrined by many liberal thinkers today. The reality is that all of us are constantly changing our views with more information, and it may be a mistake to be judged by a static and forever living statement that's on the internet. How about an example that might challenge people to look at their own past? So in 1994, Ace Ventura was a box office smash with over 100 million in ticket sales. It propelled Jim Carrey to superstardom to the teenagers of my generation. But who remembers how that movie ended? And in case you don't, when it was revealed that the antagonist is transgender, basically both Jim Carrey and all the policemen go to uncontrolled vomiting at the idea. And the reality was, in 1994, the majority of the US public saw this as funny. And I'm betting that many 40-something liberal-minded people today were teenagers who were potentially laughing in the movie theater along with it. If this movie were to be released today, movie theaters would be burned to the ground. But the morals of the US population have changed and grown in the last 25 years. And that's a good thing. Somewhat ironically, Jim Carrey is sort of a hero in the liberal movement today with his paintings and depictions of Trump. He's publicly stated that Ace Ventura was a mistake. We have to allow ourselves and others the ability and chance to grow and develop, and cancel culture doesn't allow for that. So while Jim Carrey has been given a pass, let's look at others who may not have been. So perhaps you know the story of Neil Golightly. He became famous this year because he was fired from his position at Boeing because of an article he wrote 33 years ago. As a young pilot in the Navy in the early 80s, he held the position that the opinion that women should not fight in combat. And now, even though today he readily admits he does not hold that opinion, he disagrees with the article, he's grown, never mind, Boeing caved to public pressure and fired him in July. Perhaps you know the story of Carson King. In 2018, this senior at Iowa State held up a sign at college football game day that his Busch Light supplies were running low with his Venmo account for all the public to see. When ridiculous amounts of money started pouring in, he pledged to give it all to the local children's hospital. And Anheuser-Busch then pledged to match all those donations, a figure that reached over $3 million. Then a reporter for the Des Moines Register dug up two potentially racist jokes he had tweeted as a 16-year-old. And this, he not only lost his corporate backing, he was publicly shamed. And then what can only be considered the greatest irony, the reporter who did the research and published the article in the Des Moines Register was found to have some potentially offensive tweets in his background, and he was fired. And if you see all these as reasonable consequences, which you can argue yes or no, I would ask that how young are we going to look in people's actions and judge them by? When they're adults, if teenagers acceptable ground, how low can we go? Can we go to 14, 12, 10? Where does it stop? There has to be consequences fitting to an action, but simultaneously forgiveness allowed for personal growth. Whether you believe cancel culture exists or not, society seems to have a hard time understanding that we have to let people change, grow, and we need to keep perspective on the moral relativism of history. So whenever I want to feel that more deeply, I remind myself of something that I've discussed in a sermon before. That is the concept that we do not develop our morals in some sort of a vacuum, and that societal norms have a larger influence on our views than we believe. Furthermore, history has consistently shown that the views of the past become morally problematic in the future. So I'm almost certain that I hold beliefs that will be morally reprehensible 50 years from now. The idea that 2020 is somehow the peak of morality is almost mathematically impossible. So we should all want to allow for growth, as we all probably hold troubling views that history says we are blind to see. Now, beyond the allowance for personal growth, the second concept is a lack of nuance. that there is often no allowance for a gray or middle area that we can all discuss as it relates often to social justice issues. It seems at times a figure cannot be troubled with a part of a movement without being seen as fully against it. For example, Martina Navratilova, who has an iconic history in the LGBTQ community, lost her sponsorship for the suggestion that it might be unfair to let trans women compete against biologically born women in sports. She explained that perhaps this is a case where women's rights are being compromised in the name of trans rights. Once again, you don't have to agree with the point that Martina is making to consider this cancel culture. You have to acknowledge that her belief is probably not rooted in hate and that consequences may not be proportional to her actions. In another example, a New York Times investigative journalist published a piece citing dozens of psychologists who privately disagreed with Planned Parenthood's policy to provide transitioning hormones on self-diagnosis to a minor without the examination of a psychologist, but who would never come out publicly as they would consider it career suicide. And the issue here is not whether Planned Parenthood is right or wrong in this policy. The issue is the fact that merely questioning it would come with such steep consequences. In the wake and the emotion of the protests in the name of police reform this summer, James Bennett was forced out of the New York Times for merely allowing the publication of a United States senator who called for troops to bring order to our cities. And while I vehemently disagree with the point Senator Tom Cotton made in his letter, I believe we should look at the opinion section of our newspaper as a cauldron of viewpoints and not myopic in perspective. The fallout went further as Barry Weiss resigned from the New York Times as one of the few remaining centrists on staff, citing an abusive environment for her views and a cancel culture mentality. While this does seem to hit the mark, there may be irony here, as Barry Weiss, who is Jewish, became famous in college for calling for the firing of college professors with pro-Palestinian views. So the message might be right, but the messenger could be seen as hypocritical, which really is probably a core to this entire problem. We all tend to skew to our team. To some, Colin Kaepernick's ejection from the NFL was reasonable consequences for his actions, and to others, it was pure cancel culture. Cops have been fired for tweeting Black Lives Matter. Reporters have been fired for tweeting All Lives Matter, and on and on. So where do we go from here? And what is our out? There are some who look at where we are and say, historically speaking, we have every marker of a nation that is heading to civil war. And that the more we can't stand opposing perspectives or those that present them, the more we head down that path. We need to be able to respectfully disagree with one another, but keep the conversation going. But who can lead us in these conversations? As our institutions all seem to be leading us apart. So I would offer one perspective. The history of the court jester is quite possibly more important than many realize. It is often believed that these were not just some buffoons for pure entertainment, but were intelligent and important in their role to challenge the king into his decisions and point out the absurdities of his kingdom. Look at the voices who speak loudest on the political and cultural front today. Sure, some are journalists in background, but the loudest and more popular seem to be comedians. From Jon Stewart to Bill Maher to John Oliver, they have been at the forefront of pointing out the absurdity of our society. The comic is able to say things that others can't, and we must relish that role in society to challenge our notions. We should all want to listen to our own personal court jester to challenge our thoughts and views on the world with no fear of retribution. You may not agree with Dave Chappelle or Ricky Gervais, but they may be the greatest weapon against the risk of cancel culture. And you may not agree with some of the examples presented here today to meet the criteria of cancel culture, and that is all understandable. But no matter what you view as cancel culture or not, you probably do not want to live in a world where we all are forced to believe the same things or face unreasonable consequences.
So, given all of the discussion that we've just had, I'd like to challenge people to think about some nuance within cancel culture, specifically distinguishing between cancel culture and call-out culture. For those of you who are familiar with Jamila Jamil, I came across the following post that really drove home an important distinction. The pivotal difference between cancel culture and call-out culture. Calling out means pointing out someone's mistake, condemning it if it is harmful to others, and demanding that someone does better. Canceling means deplatforming someone and calling for their job and position of power to be entirely taken away, often for the foreseeable future. I rarely support cancellation unless the person, company has done irrevocable harm or hurts more people than they help or refuses to shift on their dangerous, bigoted views or behavior. So start thinking about how you can call out people in a way that may lead to civil discussion, even progress, keeping in mind that people tend to operate with two different types of truths. This was actually explained in a Joe Rogan podcast with Jordan Peterson, neither of whom are strangers to controversy themselves. So a tool truth is one of the truths that people function with, and this serves a purpose for that individual as they interact with the world. And then people also have an objective truth. If we take away someone's tool truth too quickly, we may be faced with backlash and resistance. So think about how to call out in a way that will lead to discussion and growth. In order to maintain a liberal society, we need to have space for a wide range of ideas. And by attempting cancellation, we run the risk of giving more power to the canceled. Use context and your own truths to disagree in a way that serves to give power to your own voice, as opposed to simply shutting down the other. My call to you all is to focus on building relational resilience. We need to increase our ability to engage in civil discourse to move forward as a collective. And as you are doing this, keep in mind three things: notice, accept, and invite. Notice your feelings, sensations, responses that come up when you're faced with sexism, racism, misogyny, etc. Accept that experience and invite conversation that will likely be difficult or uncomfortable. Challenge by choice and call out before you cancel.
Thanks for listening to another episode of the Harmony UU podcast. Check us out online at harmonyuu.org for more details. You can also find us on Facebook. Just search Harmony UU. If you're in the Cincinnati area, please stop by one of our services on the first and third Sunday of each month at 10 a.m.